Hello guys, today I'm going to be building this Dockside diorama for my LCM 3 in 1/35th scale from Trumpeter. So I built this LCM back in August and I was really pleasantly surprised by how well the video did and all the encouraging comments and feedback that I got about that. I had always intended to do a small diorama for the LCM, but I didn't really want to do your kind of standard beach landing one. This project got put on the sidelines a couple of times, but now at the start of 2024 I'm trying to push out all these old projects which I had sitting around for a while. These landing craft were of course used in a variety of roles in World War II, transporting troops, vehicles and supplies. Perhaps most famously they were used on beach landings including Normandy and D-Day. But I wanted to do something slightly different from that because I think it's quite hard sometimes to capture the action of those scenes. So I decided to go for a dockside cargo-based diorama. There's lots of great photos out there that I can use for inspiration and reference, loading all kinds of things, boxes, sacks, jerry cans, etc. onto LCMs, even a jeep in this case. Got wounded soldiers in this case. I really love this colour photo here. And this one here, I know this is not an LCM 3, but I really like this photo, and this would be one of my greatest inspirations actually for this diorama. So with that in mind, I started by taking some 10mm and 6mm XPS foam to use as the base. As you can see, this is quite a large model and takes up almost the entire depth of my cutting mat there. Here I'm roughly scoring around the LCM and then cutting a hole in a sheet of the foam, because of course a fairly large part of the craft will be under the waterline. One thing I made sure to do here was to keep the bits that I cut out the middle. With an LCM shaped hole in one sheet of foam, I took another sheet of the same size without the hole, used the offcuts to act as supports, and then put the sheet with the hole in it on top. That let the LCM sit at a decent level without me using lots of sheets of foam. The other thing I could do was use a bit of a cheeky trick to get a gradient on the water surface, so I made one of the supports slightly lower than the other, pushed the surface down when it was being glued. That was a dead easy way to give a gentle gradient to the water surface. These are all stuck with PVA glue, then edged with wood from the hobby store. There are various ways to do water effects. Tissue paper and PVA glues are my favourites, but to be honest, when I was doing this here I wasn't really feeling it. It just wasn't quite working the way I wanted. I don't know why. So at some point I gave up on the tissue paper and I waxed some PVA glue all over the top of it and decided to use some aluminium foil instead. I used a couple of layers of foil, with of course the texture providing the wave detail. When those layers of foil were happily glued down, I gave everything a coat of Tamiya Grey primer. Then I neatened up the edges with a knife, and where there was a bit of a rough edge, I used this gloss gel to smooth it out. I then applied 2 coats of paint, first of all a Tamiya XF2 white, and then Tamiya XF17 sea blue. The sea blue is quite a dark colour. I haven't painted it on consistently, and as you can see I've tried to accentuate some of the texture there in the foil. As you can see, the middle of the base looks quite rough there with all that foil, but of course that's where the LCM is going to go, and I want to keep that foil flexible so it will fold down under the LCM and I can just fill the gaps in, hopefully quite easily, with some gel. This is a Liquitex gel that I use for the edges, and I'm now going over the entire ocean surface there. This will help to build a depth effect. I'm slopping it on any old how and then going back over it to get rid of the brush strokes. This will dry clear, as you can see here. And already we've got a fairly good level of depth, I think, in that ocean. However, I did add a few more areas of light grey, again to try to accentuate the depth, and then another layer of the gel. Now you might notice I've left a big gap there at the side of the base, and that is for the dockside wall. That was made from some 10mm XPS foam. I measured out some lines for the stonework there, then carved them in with my hobby knife. At this stage I was looking at reference photos like this one here, in particular the really dark line there that marks the high water mark on the dockside. Once I'd carved the stones, I used a screwed up ball of kitchen foil over all the surface to give some texture. I also used some sculpting tools to push in and pull out certain stones and bricks to break up the evenness of the depth of the bricks there. Then I did a very similar thing on the triangular piece, which will be the road at the top. This time some slightly smaller bricks, but the same technique, scoring them in. Aluminium foil texture, and some refinement and damage with the knife. For any kind of painting on XPS foam, I like to give a base coat of acrylic paints. These are just cheap artist acrylics thinned with water and slapped on quite thick. From my experience, they form the best kind of base coat. Of course, a lot of spray can primers will damage the foam. And of course, it's quite hard to airbrush directly onto the foam because of the high surface area. So by brushing these on, I can make sure the paint's thin enough that it goes into all the gaps. And then I can airbrush over the top with a light grey colour. You can see I've deliberately left some of that base coat visible, as that gives me some tonal variation. And with a variety of greys from the Vallejo model colour range, I pick out individual bricks. Here I'm concentrating the dark grey, green, brown colours on the lower half of the wall to try to give that high water mark like I showed you in the reference photo. Of course, the mistake I made here, which I corrected later, was that I had that high water mark magically on the mortar line between two bricks. Of course, in reality it should be probably partially up one brick. A similar technique was used on the road, except this time I was focusing more on light greys, beiges and light blue colours. Oil paints were very much the order of the day for weathering the wall. In this case a variety of brown colours, but also a couple of greens. I used various techniques including a pin wash, so the oil paint was thinned with odourless thinner and applied to select areas. And streaking effects where I put dots of oil paint on and drag them in a downwards pattern with a brush dampened in odourless thinner. The idea here is just to make the wall look dirty, used, abused, weathered, etc. The rough nature and the matte finish of this foam makes it quite hard to get narrow streaks, but that's not such a problem. At the moment they do look quite stark, but once you've got a bit of experience with oils, you realise that things fade quite significantly once they're dried. so you need to get a bit of contrast in there initially, otherwise the effects will be invisible in the end. You don't always have to blend the oils in a downwards motion. You can blend them in sort of swirl patterns or horizontally and thin them to discolour individual bricks or groups of bricks. As I went to dry fit the wall, I realised that there was a small problem. It was far too high for the LCM. And if I was to have some kind of loading and unloading scene, that wasn't really going to work. However, that was easily fixed. I simply removed the bottom 3 layers of stones from the dockside wall. I also thought the wall looked a bit plain, so I cut a few lengths of wood and roughed them up with some very coarse sandpaper to make some wooden pillars to break up that line. Unfortunately, I didn't film the adding of those, but you'll see them in a moment. One thing that was missing from the wall was the mortar. I know there are various ways you can do this, but I've always found very fine sand to be a fairly good solution. I simply drop it on, brush it into position, get rid of any excess that's on the stones, and then use this VMS ballast freeze to freeze it in position. It's amazing the difference that those lightened mortar lines make compared to the darkened ones. You can see that here on the section I've done versus section that I haven't done. Sand of course is very light, so I use this streaking grime colour to darken it. Then I took my green oil paints and, starting near the bottom, added a healthy amount of discoloration, this time streaking it up the wall rather than down. I then added some 3D printed anchor points onto the dockside road, cutting away a part of the foam to make sure they're properly embedded into the road rather than floating on top of it. The final step was a very light dry brush with a light grey paint. I'm not sure how much effect that had, to be honest, but I do think at this stage the wall is starting to look like a well-used, nice and dirty dockside wall. So of course I wanted some cargo in my LCM, and we've got a few options. We've got these archive photos here showing a US LCM unloading some standard ration boxes and what looks like some sacks of food. We could of course have a vehicle inside, and that could perhaps help with my storage problem on my shelf as well. And we could even have some wounded figures being ferried back to a ship from some landing beaches or similar. However, I really liked this photo here full of jerry cans. Now I know this is not an LCM3, but I really like that kind of idea, and that's what I decided to go for. So I fired up my 3D printer and printed out a load of jerry cans and set about trying to get them into the LCM. Of course I wasn't going to fill the entire cargo space with the 3D printed jerry cans, partly because that's quite expensive and partly because just printing them would take a very long time. So instead I used some offcuts of foam, which is why I always keep offcuts of foam, and simply place the jerry cans at the front and on the top of that to give the impression that they continue throughout the stack. You'll notice there at the rear of the pile we have a gap, and that's because I couldn't quite work out what these British troops would have done with that ladder onto the deck. But I have a cunning plan to hide that small problem later. When you're working with 3D printed resin, you need to use superglue to stick parts together. When I had my rows of jerry cans stuck together, I gave them a coat of the same green coloured paint. But then I went back and I picked out individual jerry cans with slight variations of the green colour. And when we put those together, that gives us quite a pleasing overall variety. The jerry cans were also given some sponge chipping. Here we go, as we see the cans being placed in. I'm not quite sure why I decided to put them on their back rather than making them stand upright. That was a bit silly really, wasn't it? Now my plan to cover that ladder at the back involved a tarp. I initially tried one out of tissue paper but didn't quite like it. Then I tried one out of 2-part epoxy but didn't like that either. So then I tried a new method which I haven't tried before. I can't remember where I read about this, but I cut up a latex glove and used that to be the tarp. And I think that did a fairly good job. It seems to have taken the shape quite well and held its folds and so on. Although later one thing that I did notice is that it took the contours just a bit too much, and for example you could see the anti-slip pattern on the deck through the tarp, so maybe not the perfect material for this. The tarp was brush painted using Vallejo model colours and did need a couple of coats. Finally, I really wanted to dirty up the cargo area of the LCM, so I really went to work with the oil paint splatter effects. Now I obviously wanted something on the dockside to make this look like a working environment. Originally my plan was to have a crane lifting the pallets of jerry cans onto the LCM. However, if that were to be in scale, it would more than double the height of the diorama, and I simply don't have the shelf space for that. Plus, even the depth there of the road isn't really enough to contain a 1/35th scale crane. So I had to put that idea to the side. Using my 3D printer, I printed these cable reels, these sacks, and this rowing boat. The rowing boat didn't really print very well on the inside, but I'm going to have it upside down on the dockside, so that should be fine. My attempt at painting it deck tan and then using this Humbrol chipping fluid to chip back the blue to reveal the damaged wood didn't really work very well. And I had to go back over some of the chip sections with the blue paint and a sponge just to reduce their size and their general appearance. And to hide it a bit more, I used some green and some dark brown oil paints streaked down the side. That could look better, but I don't think it looks terrible. The old fishing net which I've put under it there is made from the plastic wrapper that you get oranges and mandarins, that kind of thing in. The cable reels were base coated in black, then painted with a deck tan, then given various degrees of oil washes to make the individual planks and the details on those planks stand out. Just like the anchor points that I showed you earlier, I had to really push these cable reels into the dockside to properly make them look like they were part of it rather than floating on top. The final touch for these was some enamel rust effects around the metal parts. Although I decided not to have a crane in my diorama, I still wanted to have the idea that these pallets were being lifted onto the LCM using a crane. So I got some spare wood, cut them into square shapes to make some pallets. Gave them a coat of black paint, deck tan and then an oil wash. And on this one here, added some chains to make it look like it was ready to go on the crane. At this point I still thought that the dockside looked a little bit plain and just lacked a bit of variety. So I thought maybe I could put a ladder or steps or something onto the dockside. If I'd thought about this earlier, I could have made the steps actually part of the wall, but it would require too much now to cut it away, to add those and to get the new weathering and painting to match the old. So instead I took this brass tube and started to cut it into lengths to fashion myself a ladder. With the vertical pieces taped to my cutting mat, I could superglue the rungs into position. The way that I got the curve here was to wrap the end around my X-Acto knife. And when it was all dry, we've got a ladder. Maybe not 100% accurate, maybe I should have had those built-in steps, but I didn't. In terms of the figures, it's quite hard, if not impossible, to find commercial kits of Royal Navy figures. However, I did find these on Shapeways. These are created by somebody called Holden8702. And as you can see, he has a variety of figures from different nations, different eras, and in different scales, all with quite interesting poses. Now these are quite expensive on Shapeways, and if you're like me and you're in the UK, the shipping is almost as much again. However, if you email Holden on Facebook, he will sort you out with some figures for a much more reasonable price. And that was really useful for me too, because I didn't necessarily want one of these sets, but I wanted a couple of figures from one set, a couple of figures from another set, and so on. They arrived from Spain, I think, and they arrived quite quickly. They're printed in this sort of light green resin. The details aren't super sharp, but they're pretty decent. I would say they're probably slightly better than the World War I medics figures that I did recently with my ambulance. The supports were removed before they arrived, but of course there's still a little bit of cleanup with the remains of those ends to be removed. I haven't gone into much detail about how I painted these because this video is getting quite long already and because I'm not super happy with the job I've done. Anyway, these figures are wearing number 3 working dress. I created the blue colour by mixing some Tamiya blue with some black. That initial layer was airbrushed on, and then details were brush painted with Vallejo model colours. So we've got the white of the jersey underneath. Then we have this light blue piece over the shoulders. I'm sorry, I've no idea what that's called. To paint the face, I gave a base coat of base flesh from AK, and then while it was still wet, some highlights with light flesh on the nose and the cheeks, blending it in and covering the chin as well. Nowhere near the best face effects you will see, not even my best face painting, but it's what I could do. It was quite hard to pick out some details like the life belts here, because as I say, the details were not super sharp. However, I think I did an okay job with those. At that point, with the base colours down, I gave everything a coat of VMS flat varnish to protect what I had so far. Then I used some slightly lighter and slightly darker versions of the base colours to add some highlights and shadows to the folds. Finally, a light pin wash with an oil paint, followed by a final matte varnish. Then it was time to start putting everything together. An advantage of using the foil here for the water is that it's slightly flexible, and therefore when I put the LCM into position, it should minimise the gap. That said, there is a slight gap at the rear because I simply made the hole too big. Either way, I could easily fill those gaps with some of the original gloss gel that I used, remembering of course that it does go clear, and therefore needed some small amounts of paint on top. The Dockside wall was added, with any gaps being blended in using the same technique. Once the final details were in place, my model was complete. And there we go guys, that is my LCM diorama completed. Not bad for a 7-month long project, I think. Of course I didn't work on it all that time, but I am pleased to finally get it finished, and I'm really pleased with that final result. I had lots of fun building this. The LCM lends itself to lots of different dioramas, especially sort of beach landing ones, but I wanted to do something slightly different, and I think I've achieved that here. I really had a lot of fun constructing the dockside and weathering it with oil paints, using the 3D printer to add some extra details, and of course although the figures are not super well painted, I do think their custom poses are very nice and do bring a bit more to the diorama than a standard kit of figures would, even if you could get Royal Navy figures as a set. I really hope you've enjoyed this video. I want to say thank you to all of you for watching, it's massively appreciated. I always get such great feedback and advice and information in the comment sections. It really makes a big difference to me, so thank you very much guys. Massively appreciated. Talking of appreciation, special thanks to my Patreon supporters and YouTube members who offer support to the channel on a monthly basis, and that also makes a huge difference, so thank you very much guys. This kit is another one off my halfway done list. I am starting to work on a couple of smaller side projects at the moment, but the main thing I'm working on now on the half done list is this Ardennes farmhouse diorama featuring the Stug and the Panther. I hope my figure painting skills improve because I've got a lot of figures to go in this one. I've also been 3D printing quite a lot of bits and pieces for this, so I'm hoping this will be one of my most detailed models ever. It's certainly going to be one of the biggest dioramas I've done at over 12 inches square. So if you would like to see that and future videos, then please make sure you've subscribed if you haven't already. Once again, thank you very much for watching, and until next time, have fun modelling.